Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Chapter 8, adapted from David Emory Shi's America: A Narrative History. And this deals with the economy of the United States at the beginning of the 19th century, okay, what we refer to as the market economy. Okay? Now, this specifically refers to the burgeoning capitalist society that we experience here in the United States. Again, most other nations in the world at this point were still relying on mercantilism, which again is some kind of government where the government itself is actually responsible for the economy. Okay, it takes control of factories and the means of production and so forth. But here in the United States, of course, we have a capitalist economy, which means that private industry is really the name of the game. Okay? So we'll go into a few details about this and kind of what each part of the country is doing at this point. So once the War of 1812 comes to a close, the U.S. economy ends up having to diversify really by necessity more than anything else. As we've seen with the different trade embargoes that have come through with the United States kind of taking this isolationist approach to everything concerning France and Great Britain, right? Suddenly we are left to our own devices to where we're not necessarily relying so much on imports and exports anymore. We do still to a certain degree, but by this point we're actually beginning to become more autonomous. And again, most of these industries are formed simply out of necessity rather than anything else. And necessity tends to be the brainchild of innovation, right? So anytime we encounter some kind of difficulty here, right, some kind of new invention comes along that tends to make life a little bit easier for us. And this is also the time period from 1815 all the way up until 1850, right, roughly a decade before the Civil War begins, that the United States expands the most in the shortest amount of time. Okay, we finally become a transcontinental nation. Okay, in other words, we expand all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, out west, this is where we start to see mass migration beginning to occur. Okay, and there's all sorts of reasons that people begin to move west during this period. Okay, everything from the land being vastly available and therefore cheap, for jobs that are potentially paying more than what people have back east. And of course for political and religious freedom as well. Okay, just about all of the same reasons that people immigrate to the United States in the first place. Now, in the Northeast, of course, this is where most of industry ends up occurring during this period. Okay, it's well known for being the center of factories, mills that uses steam power to actually begin to operate heavy machinery, and we see the emergence of an urban middle class for the first time. Okay, so up until now, we worked in a situation where the industrial aspect has had either the poor working class and the people who are extremely wealthy, and now we're kind of starting to see a little bit of a third class beginning to emerge here. Midwest at this point is still under development, much in the way that the far west is. And in this particular case, we're talking about commercial agriculture. Okay, so in other words, farming is now not so much just subsistence farming. In other words, people are not just growing to feed themselves or their families. Now they're growing massive scale crops, okay, so that they can actually take this and sell these crops all at market rather than just actually keeping a small percentage for themselves. Okay, and so with this, of course, comes new types of machinery. We get steel plows, we get a lot more heavy farming equipment, and so forth. And of course, in the South, this is the period when the cotton industry explodes. Okay, and unfortunately, along with it, so does slavery. Okay, and in particular, when we get the introduction of new states in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, we see slavery really beginning to take off in an extremely negative way. And 6 states are added between 1815 and 1821, okay, only in a 6-year period. So Alabama, Illinois, Indiana, Mississippi, Missouri, and Maine. And of course, with all of these new social changes, create new social problems. Okay, so we have new political issues that are coming to the forefront, people beginning to take a stance on their own individual rights, and of course we start to have more and more ethical and social debates, especially where slavery is concerned. Okay, so the closer we get to the period of the Civil War beginning, when slavery is now beginning to intensify, people are really beginning to take notice of exactly what is going on under their noses. Now, in the 18th century in the United States, as we have gotten through the last couple of decades, most Americans were still considered isolated farmers. Again, this is what we call a subsistence or a household economy. Okay? And this is why Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans of the time period really clung to this idea, because it was traditional. Okay? It was something that seemed to have kind of this romantic lifestyle attached to it, something potentially very quiet, this rural, agrarian, romantic life. Okay? But by the time we get to the 19th century, we've changed into a commercial economy. Okay, so now, rather than planting crops and growing them for your own food table, right, now you're growing them all in a massive scale so you can sell them to other people. Okay, and not only that, but livestock as well, and it's all done specifically to make a profit. Okay, so this is the major difference in between the 18th and 19th centuries for America, is that once the 19th century rolls around, we really start to see industrialization and a new commercialized economy. And part of this has to do with Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Many people point to this being kind of the watershed moment, really, for the Industrial Revolution in America, because this is a prime example of something that ends up using machinery and industry to cut down on labor costs, to cut down on time and effort, and just about everything of the above. Okay. And of course, the cotton gin in a little handheld state is the little box that you see up here at the top right. Okay, it's not much bigger probably than a shoebox, right? Probably a little bit larger than that, and it's got a crank on it. Okay, now inside are blades that are constantly spinning. Okay, and you dump the cotton balls, right, that are still attached to the little hard, sharp clusters, right, that they grow from. Drop all that into this, and once you start to spin those blades with the crank, it separates the cotton ball from the actual stem. Okay, so all the chaff and stuff gets dumped down into the bottom, and then all of a sudden, you no longer have bloody fingers trying to do this by hand anymore. Okay, and over time, of course, cotton gins become a much larger in scale as well. Okay, eventually you have industrial-sized cotton gins with giant rotating blades. Quick little personal note about this, and just to show just how dangerous this could be, my great-great-grandfather was actually killed by one of these. Family story goes that he actually fell into an industrial-sized cotton gin and, as you can imagine, was actually torn to pieces by it. Okay, so this was a time period, of course, just to use this as an example, where there were no fail-safes. Okay, for a lot of this new machinery, many people were not accustomed to using it. Okay, so it would be very easy to get hurt or killed or maimed in some way. Okay, so, and accidents end up causing people to start looking at new legislation, right? New ways of providing safety instructions, fail-safes for machines, right? Having inspections to make sure things are working and everyone is safe, right? So this is one early example of this. And for most white Americans specifically, I have to put that caveat in there for accuracy here, the rise in living does manage to occur. Okay, most people do manage to have a somewhat better lifestyle, more convenient life based on the introduction of machinery. Okay, and it's not for everybody all over the country. Again, I specifically say white Americans because white Americans at this point in time are still the ones who have the most advantage when it comes to actually finding work. Okay, even if you are a free person of color during this time period, there's no guarantee that you're going to find work or that you're going to be able to live on your own terms and fend for yourself. Okay, as terrible as it is, even in northern states where slavery has been outlawed by this point and will continue to be outlawed as time progresses, this is still not a full fail-safe here. And again, the rift that has already begun between the North and the South by this point in time begins to deepen more and more. Okay, so the political and social division between North and South, right, industry in the North and agriculture in the South, really deepens more and more with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and a lot of people in the South are not too eager to adopt it, right? They're too worried that the North is trying to take over their way of life, take away all this tradition and everything, and it's still something, unfortunately, that you hear Southerners crow about to a certain extent today. I live in Texas, and it's still a part of the culture of the quote-unquote old-timers here to a certain extent. And during this period in time, too, we also see American infrastructure going through a major overhaul. Okay? The government finally begins to take interest in this, begins allocating funds for improvements in roads, bridges, canals, the construction of lighthouses, right, deepening harbors so more ships can come in. And this becomes controversial because now all of a sudden the government is moving funds around and using them in a way that could potentially violate the Constitution somehow. Right? People are not sure how, but they are kind of suspicious about it. And so we start to facilitate more and more long-distance trade as a direct result of these new forms of transportation. And of course, there's no constitutional precedent, as I've said before, for how to fund these projects. Okay, so using government funding for this seems to be a little bit fishy to some. Now, beginning with roads themselves, of course, once we begin in the 18th century here in the United States, travel is an extremely expensive, tedious, and potentially dangerous enterprise to get into. Okay, for instance, during this point in time, before the beginning of the early republic and before roads are constructed, it would take 4 days to get from New York City to Boston by coach. Okay, and today, right, it only takes a few hours potentially. And of course, this also limits the distance when it comes to trade and marketability. Okay, so if you have produce of some kind that's being grown in the region, if you're trying to sell meat, right, from livestock or something, you can only go so far before the produce begins to spoil. And so in 1794, we get the construction of the Philadelphia-Lancaster Turnpike. Okay, this is the first major road that exists in the United States. And you can see here on the map, right, this is where the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road goes all the way from Philadelphia down into the south eventually. The next year in 1795, we'll get the Wilderness Road that opens directly through the Appalachian Mountain Range. It's the red dotted line. And by 1803, Congress finally begins to order that 5% of all the land profits in the Ohio Territory begin to go toward the construction of a national road from the Atlantic going as far west as possible. Okay, so this is kind of the first iteration of major highways that begin to open up. And of course, these are all used via horseback and wagons, right, stagecoaches. And again, using federal money to fund these things is a controversial topic because this starts to cause Southerners in particular to look at this and say, well, the North is benefiting from this, but you're not building any roads down here. Okay? So again, sectionalist concerns begin to come into these types of arguments. Okay, and people begin to worry that as long as we have a certain political party involved in, the national government, right, one side of the country or the other is going to gain favor from it. By 1821, though, we have over 4,000 miles of turnpikes constructed in the United States. And this causes new coach and freight companies to begin to furnish lower rates. Okay, so now we don't have to worry about them charging more to go on a rocky road where you might end up having a horse break its leg or a wagon wheel burst or something along those lines, right? It becomes easier and cheaper to transport people and goods. And of course, stagecoaches begin to become more and more popular. And a stagecoach is just like the picture up here at the top right. Okay, if you ever see something like the Wells Fargo logo, for example, right, this is the image that pops into mind. Okay, and stagecoaches are called that because they end up stopping in stages along a certain designated path. Okay, and usually they do this in order to refresh the horses about every 40 miles. Okay, if you have the same team of horses riding for hundreds of miles or something, eventually the horses are going to get tired. They could potentially even die along the way. Okay, you've heard of riding a horse to death. This is quite literally how it would work. And stagecoaches are, of course, a little bit faster. They're a little bit less expensive, and if you have better roads, they're much more accessible. So the next thing we can talk about here is canals. Canals at this point in time are built as a way to connect east and west traffic when it comes to shipping goods. Okay, most of the rivers in the United States tend to run from north to south. Okay, the Mississippi and other major rivers like that tend to do it that way. Some rivers, like the Ohio River, kind of snake back and forth along a certain trajectory, but canals are really supposed to be a major shipping highway at this point, and it facilitates a way of moving things from one side of the country to the next. By the 1820s, we had the introduction of steam power in the United States. Okay, we start to see steamboats and flats boats in particular being used to actually carry things up and downstream. And canals become a major thoroughfare for these types of ships. Okay, and canal barges at this point in time too are not always even powered by steam. Sometimes they're just powered by a guy with a long pole or a paddle. And they're much cheaper than wagons, of course. You don't have to worry about horsepower or anything like that. They can just be operated manually. Now, the first actual steamship that's built as a commercial vessel in the United States is called the Clermont. You see the picture of it there at the top right. It's built by Robert Fulton and is funded by Robert Livingston. Okay, if you recall, Robert Livingston was the guy who actually facilitated the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, he went to London to meet with Napoleon and got the deal to actually take the whole of the Louisiana Territory. And wood-fired steamboats at this point, which is, again, this is before the use of coal, but this leads to a lot of widespread river traffic, okay, the use of these types of boats. And they're extremely dangerous, for one thing, because a wood-burning ship that is already constructed out of wood could potentially catch fire and sink very easily, okay? Not to mention the fact that these would quite often carry not only passengers but also livestock. And of course, it's worth noting too that by it's not until the 1850s that these actually had bathrooms. Okay, so quite often, if you were stuck on a riverboat, you would either have to jump ship or hold it in. Okay. And of course, the idea of canals here, like I said before, is to create this thoroughfare from the east to the west. And it ends up facilitating a greater transcontinental market now. We can actually begin to ship goods across canals in a cheaper, easier, and safer way than actually doing it over land. And this causes shipping prices to go down quite a bit, ends up increasing profits for shipping companies. And major cities like St. Louis become known as the gateway to the West for these types of structures. Okay, it becomes a very important river port. This is where Lewis and Clark set out from, after all. And it also causes cities like New Orleans to become extremely wealthy. New Orleans, in particular, becomes the wealthiest city in the United States by 1840, specifically because of its trade with Latin America. It empties out into the Gulf, into the Caribbean. And of course, the most famous canal in the United States is the Erie Canal. Okay, this was constructed in 1825. You see an artist rendering of it here. And this actually connects the Great Lakes in the Midwest to the Hudson River in New York City, okay, which of course then dumps out into the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so it allows the import and export of major goods to and from Canada, to and from the Midwest, that would have taken several weeks to get there over land. Okay, and in some cases, if it's produce or something like that, it could potentially spoil. And the Erie Canal is the longest canal in the world. It's 363 miles long. It goes across New York. And it causes the Midwest and New York City to grow exponentially. The downside to this, though, is it causes the South to become increasingly more isolated. And of course, this is what causes a lot of sectionalist rifts in the United States. People in the South begin to argue that the federal government is spending too much money on the North and on the Midwest and neglecting them. And of course, the longest lasting and potentially most effective form of transportation during this point in time are railroads. Okay, the first steam-powered railway actually begins operating in England in 1825. And from 1830 to 1850, the U.S. goes from only 23 miles of railroad to over 30,000 miles. Okay, and this is kind of difficult to see because the map is so small here. I apologize for this. But you see just one or two small dots on the 1830 point of this map, and by the time you get to 1850, right, it's like red veins running all over most of the northern part of the country. And by the time you get to 1860, of course, it covers virtually the entire eastern portion of the United States. And there's a lot of major benefits to the railroad. Okay, it ends up moving more people and more freight. It's faster, cheaper than wagons or boats. Okay, you have a specific designated permanent track that it operates on, and it can operate year round. Okay, it's not necessarily subject to the elements. Okay, it can actually move in winter when other forms of transportation are not available. And of course, it extends more and more commerce to towns without the all the problems that go along with creating a man-made road or building a canal. Okay, building a train track just simply is a matter of getting it through geographical issues. And of course, there's plenty of drawbacks to this as well. Okay, it leads to a lot of political corruption and bribery because of all the profit that can be made off of it. Leads to a lot of decline when it comes to Native American culture. And of course, for better or for worse, it ends up accelerating life in the United States. It brings a lot of noise where noise didn't exist before. Okay? And it ends up changing the culture entirely. Train depots become the new town center rather than churches. A lot of more town construction actually goes along the railroads, so some towns exist simply because the railroad exists. And it creates a larger demand for railroad equipment too. New railroad corporations become some of the first major multi-million-dollar businesses in the United States. And of course, in many cases, their executives tend to be very corrupt. Little trivia point here too is the fact that railroads actually begin to popularize the idea of pocket watches because the railroad operates on time. Okay, and because we have steam power now, we can actually begin to designate a specific time to when something can leave and arrive. Okay, it can actually be brought down to that close of a science. In 1845, we had the launch of the Rainbow as the first clipper ship. Okay, and clipper ships are supposed to be a faster, more exponential way of getting goods overseas as well. Okay, and these are built specifically for speed. They're supposed to be about twice as fast as merchant ships are, and they're developed because we began a tea trade with China. Okay, remember Thomas Jefferson was the first president to really open up trade with China via Alexander Hamilton. And by 1848, we also get the California Gold Rush. Okay, and so we now have no real major way of getting things overland from the East Coast to the West Coast yet. Okay, there's too many obstacles in the way, the Sierra Nevada mountains and so forth. And so we have a demand on the West Coast suddenly for supplies. Okay, so we actually have to sail around the southern horn of South America and come back up the other side. Okay. In 1854, the Flying Cloud manages to make the trip from New York to San Francisco in only 89 days. And these ships are built to be light. Okay, they're supposed to have room for cargo, but no passengers. Okay, so they're not necessarily a commercial vessel in that regard. And of course, anytime we have quicker transportation in the United States, it also facilitates quicker communication. Okay, and from 1790 to 1860, we have an exponential increase in the number of post offices in the U.S. Goes up from 75 to nearly 29,000. And of course, steam-powered printing presses also reduce newspaper prices as well. Okay, people don't actually have to make newspapers by hand anymore; they can print multiple ones, and so the prices go down from 6 cents to only 1 cent. This is also the period in time where Samuel Morse becomes famous. Okay, he invents the electromagnetic telegraph in 1844, and of course now we know him for being the one to create Morse code. And Samuel Morse's reason for doing this is actually rather tragic. The story goes that he was out of town on some business, and his wife actually fell ill and died while he was gone, and he didn't even get the news that she was sick until after she had passed. So born out of this tragedy, he decided to invent something that created instantaneous communication so no one else would ever have to suffer the same tragedy that he did. And by 1850, most major cities in the U.S. are directly connected by this type of communication. Okay, you have telegraph offices typically set up at most train depots, so you could actually go there, give a message to somebody, and it could be relayed in Morse code over land through wire. Now, at this point in time, too, we also have the United States gradually beginning to transform from an agrarian society into a much more defined capitalist nation based on industry. Okay, so from the period at the beginning of the 19th century until the eve of the Civil War is really when this growth period ends up occurring. Okay? And of course, now we have transportation that's being financed not only by private people, right? We don't just have individual donations and so forth. We actually have government investment, which hasn't ever happened before. And again, this creates a large constitutional debate because there's not really anything in the Constitution that says the government can or cannot do this. And most of the issues that are brought up about this, again, tend to be sectionalist. It's typically the Southerners who are creating the most arguments about this, saying that the South is being neglected by the government. Most of the funds for these types of things, railroads and so forth, are not extending to the South. And part of that has to do with the fact that the South is still stuck in this agrarian state. Okay, it's only producing agriculture via slave labor. Okay, and so these types of goods can only be transported so far before they end up spoiling in some cases. Federal government also begins to send U.S. cavalry west to end up eliminating native tribes, and this continues well on into the later portion of the 19th century. Okay, all the way until we get to roughly the year 1900 and even a little after. Stephen Douglas is an individual who becomes popular during this point in time. He's a Democratic senator from Illinois who becomes a rival for Abraham Lincoln. Okay, once we get to the election of 1860, and even a little bit before that, he and Lincoln end up getting into a series of political debates about the future of the United States. And Douglas is one who really begins to push for more infrastructural improvements. He actually manages to convince Congress to fund a land grant which supports building more and more canals and railroads to connect Chicago to the South, to Mobile, Alabama in particular. And by 1860, we have 20 million acres that are accrued for such specific projects, okay, that are actually pinpointed. And of course, the biggest feature of industrialization in the United States is the transformation from handmade goods to mass production. Okay? We have machines now that are considered to be labor-saving machines. Okay, it means that humans don't have to work nearly as hard. And these machines are able to produce larger quantities of a certain commodity. And they're usually a cookie-cutter version of each other. Okay? It allows things to be produced at a cheaper price for more people, and the more items can be sold, the higher the profits. Okay, so this is really more about quantity rather than quality. Okay, and that becomes kind of the major argument against industry at this point, is the fact that if you are someone who is involved in a specialist area, right, if you're a silversmith, if you're a shoemaker or something like that, suddenly it seems like you're being inched out of the way by new machines that can do the same thing you can for a lot less cost. And of course, now we have standardized parts for machines too. Okay? Machines are not necessarily one of a kind anymore. You can find the same type of factory machine in most major cities in the US. And it's also worth noting too that the number of patents goes up really quickly during this point too. By the 1850s, we have over 28,000 patents that are filed annually with the US Patent Office. In the previous century, we only had maybe a few hundred in about a decade. And by 1860, farmers are estimated to have been produced twice as much wheat. Miners are producing twice as much iron. Mill workers 4 times as much cotton cloth than they were at the beginning of the century, okay, just because of industrialization. Charles Goodyear is another individual who comes out of this point. He's the one who patents the idea of vulcanized rubber, which is used to make things waterproof, winterproof, stronger, greater elasticity. And of course, these are used in everything from the soles of shoes to hoses and eventually tires when the automobile is created. This is why we have Goodyear tires. Elias Howe patents the sewing machine in 1846. And Isaac Singer is the one who improves it for a home and factory version. Okay, you might see something like up here at the top right, a tabletop version of this. If you have grandparents who has one of these, my grandmother actually used to have a large full table-sized version that was operated by a foot pedal. Right, the thing probably weighed about 500 pounds because it was solid iron. And also by the 1850s, we have the first sewer systems developed. Okay, so you can imagine the state a major city would be in before this. The way people disposed of waste was quite simply to dump it out of a bucket into the street. Okay, so it was a pretty nasty way to live, as you can imagine. Now, once Eli Whitney's cotton gin comes into the mix here, over time, the simplicity of using it ends up causing cotton production to grow exponentially as well. It's estimated to be 50 times more efficient than one individual picking cotton balls out of the actual chaff. Okay? And people begin to refer to it as white gold because, quite frankly, cotton was such a valuable commodity. Okay? By 1812, after the War of 1812 ends, we have the cotton gin leading to a drop in production costs. Okay, so it costs a lot less to actually produce it and ends up leading to a greater profit. Okay, people can make more of it for a lot less. And so the worldwide market for it all of a sudden skyrockets. Okay, and so people are no longer just getting cotton or cotton cloth from India or anything. Now they can come to the United States and get a much more quality version of it. And southern cotton, for some reason, tends to be stronger than cotton that's grown elsewhere in the world. Okay? It's something to do with the soil composition where it grows, the climate, and so forth. And it leads to a much greater demand. People begin to court the United States when it comes to the cotton market now. And of course, cotton growing ends up spreading as well. Okay, the entire South ends up becoming embroiled in this, from Tennessee all the way here to Texas after the War of 1812 happens, and it just kind of spreads like wildfire from the east to the west. And the problem with this too is the fact that cotton growing and cotton harvesting is a major labor-intensive process. Okay, and so this is what causes slave labor to become such high demand. And slaves themselves end up becoming more and more expensive over time. Okay, by the time the Civil War breaks out and people are actually winding down the slave trade, an average individual adjusted for today's market runs somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $100,000 a person. Okay, and again, at this point in time, people weren't considered people. Okay, they were actually considered property instead. Okay, so this was something that was attached in the Southern mindset anyway to some measure of wealth and prestige, as horrific as it sounds. And in places like Maryland and Virginia, the soil composition over time had been eroded to the point to where the soil would no longer grow anything. Okay, people had been growing there for the better part of 200 years by this point, tobacco and cotton and all kinds of things that they could end up planting, and so all the nutrients in the soil ended up drying up. And so this is part of what causes people to begin to filter more and more into the South, where the land had been largely uncultivated. And from 1790 until 1860, it's estimated that over 835,000 slaves were sold to the South. Okay, and again, this is well after Thomas Jefferson puts a cap on the U.S. government's involvement in this. Okay, so again, in 1807, he says, we're not going to officially allow any more slaves to be imported. But again, as we've seen, thousands and thousands and thousands more are smuggled into the United States, sold, traded, etc. there. Now, the Midwest at this point is really becoming the center of the farming boom in the United States. By 1860, it's estimated over half of the U.S. population is living west of the Appalachian Mountains. And just a century before this, right, this was a major geographical obstacle. Nobody could actually get past the mountains until Daniel Boone creates the Wilderness Path. 30 to 40% of Americans who were born in New England during this period in time began to move west. So it's not necessarily even people who are natives of the Midwest. It's more and more immigrants who are moving there. And the land in the Midwest is primed for farming because it's completely flat. It's mostly grassland. Again, it's been largely uncultivated, so the soil is very fertile, and it's a perfect place to grow large crops. Corn becomes the most planted crop specifically because it's so versatile. Okay, you can use it to feed humans. Most livestock can eat it, ingest it, and have no problems. And it's also considered to be a crop that's actually hospitable to other crops. It's a good partner crop, I guess is what they call it. You can actually plant it in close proximity with wheat and with other major crops, and it won't steal nutrients from them. It won't steal moisture and so forth. And so some certain species like pumpkin, squash, and beans become more and more symbiotic with corn, and we start to see these grown side by side. Jethro Wood invents the iron plow in 1819. It allows people to pull it behind a large ox or something along those lines. And of course, John Deere is the one who invents the steel plow. Okay? And steel, of course, has a much heavier composition to it. It's lighter, it's stronger, and it can actually end up, breaking through some of the hard ground that's never been cultivated before. Cyrus Hall McCormick also presents the mechanical reaper for the first time too. This is one of those sets of spinning blades that you see that's actually pulled behind a team of oxen or something along those lines, and ends up breaking up the ground, ends up harvesting whatever can be harvested, whatever it happens to be, whether it's corn or wheat or so forth. And it ends up increasing productivity by 24 times. Okay, so you no longer have one person with a scythe going up and down the rows and collecting this. Now you have a machine that can do it for you. The textile industry is another thing that's affected really heavily by the Industrial Revolution in the aftermath of the cotton industry exploding. Once we had the shift from wood power to hydropower to coal, then we have more and more industrial growth, for better or for worse. In 1705, the steam engine is actually invented for the first time, and the improvement is actually made by James Watt, who you see here in 1765. Samuel Slater brings the idea of hydro-powered spinning machines to America. Okay, so these are like a mill wheel, like you would see perhaps in like a film where you see like a running river, or you see a giant wheel that's actually being moved by the running water itself. That's what we have as hydropower. And the textile industry in America is very small at first. Okay, it's heavily affected by the embargo that Jefferson puts out in 1807. The War of 1812 slows it down quite a bit, and it's really not until after the war ends that it begins to increase in popularity, in part because of cotton. And as you can imagine, the South is actually opposed to this idea because they're so reliant on imports from overseas. Okay, they don't like the fact that their way of life is being quote-unquote infringed upon. In 1813, the Boston Associates construct the first textile mill in Waltham, Massachusetts, and a second one's constructed in 1822 along the Merrimack River, which is north of Boston. And it's named for Francis Cabot Lowell. He's the leader of the Boston Associates. And this dynamic at this particular factory, this mill that is, ends up becoming kind of a model for a few future ones, again, for better or for worse, because of some of the precedents that it sets. Lowell ends up hiring several young women from the ages of 15 to 30, and they're considered to be the first American factory workers. There's a surplus of young women living in New England during this time because a lot of males are actually migrating westward to work on the railroad, to work in mines, and so forth. And so most of the young men leave as single men, okay, and they leave single women behind. And women at this point in time are drafted to work in the textile industry because the textile machines themselves have a lot of smaller parts. It's argued that women have smaller hands, better manual dexterity, and they're able to actually use the machines better than a man could. And also, unfortunately, they're willing to do more work for less pay. This is a point in time where we have a very large wage gap between men and women that has gradually begun to shrink over time, but again, still a long way off from total equality. And the Lowell girls, as they're known at this point in time, are given room and board, they're taught discipline, they're given education, and their work days are rather stringent compared to what we have today. They work 13 hours a day, 5.5 days per week. Okay, so this was a pretty heavy workload, as you can imagine. But again, they live there, they work there. It's an entire dormitory type situation. And the Lowell girls are the first ones to actually begin to go on strike in the United States to oppose the working and living conditions there, right? Again, this is before machines had fail-safe, so girls were losing fingers and hands to the machines. Some of them could easily get killed in the process. And of course, over time, as more and more girls show up, right, it becomes crowded, it becomes dirty. And of course, the factories themselves end up putting out pollution into the air. Girls were getting sick. And in some cases, whether people realize it or not, in textile mills especially, the fiber from the textiles can actually get into the air as particles, and people can actually end up suffocating over time. It'll actually end up lining their lungs, and it causes them all kinds of respiratory issues. By 1850, 40% of the girls who are working in the Lowell factory are Irish immigrants who are desperate for work. And cities themselves begin to grow quite a bit during this point in time as well. Most of the time due to new forms of industry that require people who are not really skilled in any way, right? You can be an unskilled worker operating a machine and have no prior experience doing it. Whereas if you are trying to get into a skilled position, you have to go through a period of training to learn how to become, a silversmith, a shoemaker, a clockmaker, whatever it happens to be. It takes several years to apprentice and master the technique. But if you're an unskilled worker, you're trained on the job to do it. Okay? And it causes more and more people to migrate out of rural areas and into cities and towns. Lowell's population in 1820 starts at only 200 people, and 20 years later it's at 21,000. And factory centers look exactly like this picture here. Okay, this is before the Environmental Protection Agency comes into play, 150 years later, right? This is before we have any kind of concern for the environment. And so factories are pouring out just gigantic black clouds of coal smoke. It's killing animals, it's killing plants, it's killing humans in the process. And it's causing a lot of environmental decay. Dam construction ends up flooding pastures, killing fish. Forests are cleared, the soil becomes eroded or polluted. And between 1820 and 1840, American manufacturing ends up increasing by 800%. Okay, so this is not something that's going away anytime soon. And by 1860, New York becomes the first city to surpass 1 million people in the United States, at least in modern times anyway. This is the first city we have. Popular culture begins to come out during this point in time too, because now that there's an urbanized and industrialized form of society that's existing out there, specifically in the working and the middle class, people are actually given a day off every now and then. Okay? In other words, they don't have to work 12 or 18 hours a day, 7 days a week anymore. And so people have leisure time and they begin to develop new forms of entertainment. For one thing, by 1829, this is a startling figure, but it's estimated that 3/4 of the nation is estimated to have drunk at least 4 ounces of hard liquor on a daily basis. Okay, there's that much of a demand for it. And so taverns and social clubs become the cultural centers of the country. Okay, this is something that's existed since colonial times and becomes more and more popular as time goes on. And it's part of the reason why the temperance movement becomes so popular, especially after 1850, which we'll talk about in a future chapter. Among the working poor class, blood sports are probably the most popular form of entertainment, human and animal. So you have people who are engaging in prize fighting, boxing, you have dog fights, cockfights, anything that people can bet on another individual to win or lose at. Okay? And prize fighting becomes the most popular because quite often it's a public spectacle that often ends in death. People literally beat each other to death. When it comes to indoor entertainment, theaters become the most popular form. Okay? You have everything from operas to Shakespearean tragedies that are performed in these indoor theaters. And by the 1830s, we get the unfortunate advancement of minstrel shows in the United States. And these are what end up setting so many precedents for racial stereotypes in the United States. This is where the introduction of blackface comes in, as you see here from this poster. Features a lot of banjo and fiddle music, a lot of lowbrow humor that's played into skits and so forth. And this is where we get the creation of the character known as Jim Crow that you see here at the top right. This is supposed to be a disabled African-American slave that is played out as a fool and becomes, again, a racial epithet that's used, a slur over time. And the man who's responsible for a lot of the music that's played in these is a man who we still know for a lot of his songs even today, a man named Stephen Foster. He writes over 200 songs that are used in minstrel shows, including O Susanna and the Camptown Races. And immigration, of course, is a major feature of this time period because the United States is finally beginning to bounce back and come into its own as a successful nation. Okay? By the 19th century, we see a lot of heavy immigration to the United States for this reason, and for many other reasons as well. Okay? There's a lot of warfare going on in Europe, whereas the United States is geographically isolated from it. And people migrate for all kinds of reasons, for better jobs, higher wages, tax breaks, cheap land, religious freedom, the right to vote when they didn't have it before. Right? There's all kinds of reasons. And by this point in time, too, it's worth noting that this introduction of unskilled labor and the need for it, the demand for it, causes the United States to actually begin to advertise overseas, something that we wouldn't imagine it doing today because of all the immigration going on. But the U.S. actually begins to actively recruit immigrants for labor. Quite often, you would actually have people waiting at the docks for people to, once they get off the boat, come up to them and say, "Hey, are you looking for work?" Okay? And in many cases, it's an exploitation ruse. Right? Sometimes you'll have people who are unscrupulous factory owners who will come and recruit people, and then they have to work in a sweatshop for the rest of their lives. Between 1845 and 1854, it's estimated 2.5 million immigrants arrive in the United States. And the largest influx in this first wave during this point in time, there's two major waves. One that occurs in about the first half of the 19th century, and the second wave comes in the second half. First wave comes from Ireland and Germany primarily. Okay? And German immigrants in particular are mostly skilled craftspeople. Okay? They're the ones who are educated professionals. Right? They end up being doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers. And again, if they're a skilled craftsman, right, they could be a clockmaker, they could be a furniture maker, something that requires a lot of time, skill, and training to accomplish. And they bring all kinds of different denominations with them as well. Okay, many of them are Lutherans, there are a few Roman Catholics, and there are many German Jews who come to the United States for the first time as well. And most of them tend to immigrate as families. Okay, this is something that's a major feature of first wave immigration because they end up preserving their culture in the United States. They bring all of the comforts of home along with them. And they tend to settle in rural areas more than anywhere else, and quite often in places where there is no market yet for their skills, so they're able to actually corner the market. And you get individuals like Heinrich Steinweg, who you see here. He's a piano maker. He changes his name to Steinway. Okay? And Steinway is one of the most popular and more expensive pianos that you can buy in the United States. We also get Levi Strauss. He's a German tailor. Right? He's a Jewish tailor in particular. And he's the one responsible for making denim work pants, which we now call blue jeans, right? Which everyone wears. And most Norwegians and Swedes tend to settle in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota because the climate is very similar to their home countries. And Chinese immigrants tend to be attracted more to the West because of the railroad industry. Okay? And Chinese immigrants are very different from European immigrants in terms of what their plans are. They don't tend to immigrate to the United States permanently. Okay? They try to immigrate to actually work for a while, build up some savings, and then take the money back to their home country because of the exchange rate. Okay? They can actually live as wealthy men for the rest of their lives if they make a small savings here in the U.S. And this, of course, prompts a large nativist response in the U.S. Nativists are ones who are completely anti-immigration. Right? In many cases, major businesses won't even hire immigrants in some cases because of X, Y, or Z. Okay? They'll come up with all kinds of excuses. Most of it has to do with hostility among Protestants who don't want to hire Roman Catholics who might be Irish. They don't want to hire Chinese because they practice Buddhism or Shintoism, some other form of religion. And you even get certain groups that form specifically out of hatred for immigrants. The Order of the Star-Spangled Banner is one that is founded in 1849. And there's even a political party called the Know-Nothings. Okay? They're people who are, they sponsor systemic racism here by saying, we don't want Catholics, we don't want any immigrants coming to the United States. And the reason they're called the Know-Nothings is because when they're supposed to be some kind of a secret organization. So when people ask them about the organization, their response is supposed to be, "I know nothing." And the two men you see here in the images that just popped up, Heinrich Steinweg is the one up here at the top, and Levi Strauss is on the bottom here. Now, it's worth noting the Irish in particular during this point because they make up such a large percentage of immigrants to the U.S. Most of their immigration reasons have to do with the Irish potato famine, which occurs around 1845. It's estimated that over 1 million people in Ireland end up starving to death as a direct result of this. And at this point in time, too, Ireland only is populated by 8 million people. So 1/8 of the entire population dies as a result of this. And nearly 2 million of them end up immigrating, most of them either to Great Britain or to the United States. By the 1850s, over 50% of the population of Boston and New York is made up of Irish immigrants. And most of the time, they are funneled into impoverished neighborhoods. They are caused to live in very poor conditions. The men often end up working in manual labor jobs, building canals or railroads, and the women are either put into textile mills or are employed as house cleaners. Okay? And the Irish themselves are also given very negative stereotypes as being very filthy, having bad temper, being alcoholics, having too many children, all kinds of things are associated with them, and so people begin to look down on them as they come to the U.S. And of course, Protestants at this point in time tend to make up the largest portion of religious individuals in the United States, and so once Catholicism is brought over by the Irish, they're already given kind of a negative reaction here. The Irish also get into a lot of race-based tensions with African Americans who are free people of color during this point because of labor competition. In some cases, employers are given the option to hire either a free person of color or an Irish immigrant. And in many cases, if the factory owner is a nativist, they might not want to hire either one for reasons of either not wanting to hire an immigrant or not wanting to hire, again, a person of color. But many Irish immigrants do meet with some success. Okay, we have Alexander Stewart, who is the founder of A.T. Stewart and Company. This is the largest department store in the U.S. at the time. Michael Cudahy founds the Cudahy Packing Company. And Victor Herbert becomes a very famous musician and composer during the time. And the Irish become very influential in America. Okay, they end up fostering most of the trade unions when it comes to unskilled workers. They support the Democratic Party once it's actually established, and they make Roman Catholicism the largest religious denomination in America. Now, a word on organized labor here, too. By 1800, it's estimated that 12% of Americans are working for wages outside of their home. Okay? By 1860, though, that number jumps to 40%. Okay? So the move, again, from an agrarian society to an industrialized society is becoming more and more prominent over time. And most skilled workers who are trained in a specific area are opposed to the presence of factories and mass production, quite often, again, because they're being inched out of the way. Okay, so people who are self-employed, who are craftspeople, are going on the decline. Okay, they tend to charge more for their products because they're of better quality, number one, and because they take more time to produce. Okay, so people are more apt to go and buy something that's mass-produced because they can get it quicker and cheaper than going to a craftsperson. So the focus now is on quantity over quality. So shoe shops, where you might have a cobbler who hand makes shoes, are suddenly being replaced by shoe factories, where shoes can be manufactured on, a conveyor belt. And trade associations began to be organized during the 19th century as well. These end up lobbying the government for protection through tariffs. Okay, so in other words, they try to convince the government to put taxes on imports coming from overseas so that more people have to buy something produced in the United States. And they limit the number of workers to preserve their wages, too, okay, so that people don't have to take a pay cut for hiring new people. And they gradually begin to provide insurance benefits for the first time. They draft new safety regulations, they try to improve conditions, create, inspections to make sure the machines are working, that no one's going to get hurt. And trade unions become very political over time, as we'll see, especially once we get into the later part of the 19th century. Okay, they begin to argue for the abolishment of debtors' prisons, which were a thing at the time, and also the regulation of banks so that the economy can remain stable. And the last bit we'll talk about here today is the rise of new professions in the U.S. Social changes because of industrialization end up leading to the need for new services to exist in towns and cities. And this causes an individual named Horace Mann to promote the idea of free public education for the first time. This was something that was largely done through private work, tutoring. In some cases, churches would sponsor it over time, but he's the first one to say that we need to provide this as a service to the community in order to create people who are going to be contributing members of society. He facilitates the creation of normal schools, right? A normal school is one that's supposed to train future teachers. Public schools tend to focus more on boys' education, and church groups and most private academies tend to teach girls. Okay, so typically a public school at this point, at least in their first iterations, were made up of largely young males who were going into major industries of some kind, and then again churches and private academies would tutor girls. And teaching at this point in time was typically a precursor to studying law. Okay, so if you were a male and you were a teacher, eventually you were going to be apprenticed to a lawyer and become a lawyer. And law apprentices begin to be taken in by experienced attorneys. This is where we get the term interns. And by 1860, there are 60,000 self-styled physicians living in America as well. The problem is this is before medical school, so most of these individuals were frauds. Okay, so if you went to a local physician of some kind, there's no guarantee that you're not going to get some kind of snake oil to end up treating yourself or something. And medical schools end up reviving a lot of public trust during this point in time to guarantee that there is sound medical advice being given. And it's worth noting, too, that some of the cures for certain ailments during this time period seem kind of ridiculous to us. Everything from ketchup to chocolate milk was used as a medicine at one point during this period of time. And, of course, industrialization also leads to specialized training when it comes to mechanics, construction, engineering. And women are becoming more and more of a presence when it comes to nursing, becoming midwives in particular. And many women who decide to go into a long-term profession tend to become teachers as well. Okay? There's a lot of religious and social service work to be had as well. So if they are not actually working to be paid and they're looking for volunteer work, this is where they would typically find it. But certain remarkable individuals like Elizabeth Blackwell are noteworthy of the time. She's the first woman to graduate medical school in the U.S., and she ends up founding the New York Infirmary for Women and Children in 1857. And the demand for social equality also creates a large political debate as well. Now people are starting to gradually see the standard of living rise in the United States, and women are starting to gradually gain more and more rights as well. Okay, this is the period where first wave feminism is really starting to gain traction, and there becomes a greater demand for women to have a vote. Okay, unfortunately, though, it does take until 1920 for that to become a reality. But over the course of the next few decades, we start to see certain states begin to flip over and allow women to vote